Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of March 22nd, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the same operation. How are you this now nice afternoon, Josh?
I'm feeling pretty good. Looking forward to getting outside. Springtime in Austin. Always in transition.
Yeah, March. You don't like the weather, etc. Well, last week when we talked, we were going to get to talking about election reform. I should put that in quotation marks, I guess. The raft of legislation that is accumulating in the Texas Legislature, but is now beginning to move in the process and response, one might argue, to recent events in the 2020 election, but also stuff that's been building for a while. So I thought maybe we'd do that. We can start really by kind of an overview of the state of play. As we sit here and record this on Tuesday afternoon, legislation was supposed to start being heard in committee yesterday in the Senate, and then was tagged by Democratic senators, and that included in the State Affairs Committee, and that included most prominently SB 7, which is the major omnibus vehicle authored by Senator Brian Hughes, and the one that has the blessing and the low bill number assigned by the Lieutenant Governor. That bill will now be heard Friday. There'll be, along with other election-related bills in the House, they will hear HB 6, which is sponsored by newly minted election chair Briscoe Cain on this Thursday. And so we have things are kind of coming to a point this weekend, this week, at least at this point in the process. So, there are all kinds of things, and I don't want to go through every, item in both of these bills and all the others. I'm curious, Josh, if you were to say, hey, what are the one or two that really stick out to you? What are the election measures that for whatever reasons, and you can tell us the reasons, you really have noticed or really, catch your attention?
I guess I'll do one specific and one general, right? And so, the specific one that catches my attention is the provision that would require basically, some kind of documentation if someone wants to claim disability status as a reason to obtain a mail-in ballot, which is one of, again, if you've followed this podcast, if you listen to this podcast, honestly, you know about this, so we don't need to go into the details of it. I just think that one sticks out to me simply because, the politics of that seem very treacherous, ultimately placing further restrictions on people with disabilities and creating a system in which, in which election officials are somehow responsible for, certifying the disability status of people. It just, again, if it were a normal session, I'd expect to see a lot of really uncomfortable legislative hearings with a lot of witnesses coming in and discussing their disability status. So, just as a politics side of that one seems, I understand what they were trying to do or what they are trying to do because of the perception that provision was misused or may have been.
Yeah, during the 2020 election, when there was this big increase in mail-in voting because of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion of just what constituted being disabled, and very directly whether the degree to which vulnerability to the virus qualified as such, and there was motion in court. There's a lot of stuff that went on with that.
It's kind of the truth is, and
that's not to say it's a great idea, but context, that certainly is kind of the trigger here to some degree.
Well,
right?
and I think we'll get to this when we discuss this a little bit further here at the end. But there is a sense in which I think it's worthwhile, no matter what your position is on any of this stuff, to try to consider what is a good faith argument should one exist for any of these policies? And I think the idea would be is what the pandemic uncovered with the way that mail-in ballots are conducted for people with disabilities is it's probably an under-elaborated part of the law. I think we can, agree to that because ultimately it wasn't clear what counts as a disability, whether it's, again, COVID wasn't clear whether, if you had something that COVID could ultimately harm you through because you are an at-risk individual, is that a disability? And I think what I got out of all this in the election was it's not really clear what a disability is for the purpose of the election code in Texas.
And as I recall, the code had language that I think is addressed in some of this legislation that said disability or, and it wasn't threat to health. I'm thinking the wrong controversial issue, but there was language about, a perception of a threat to health that was also in there. So, that points to kind of a larger point that I think we'll get to. So, there's a whole raft of things that are in here.
I'll just say one other, because I said I was given two, and I know I spent too much time talking about the one, but I'll be quick. Generally speaking, I think the other sets of laws or, proposals that I'm interested in are ones that I think ostensibly you could say are meant to create uniformity across the election system and across the way counties conduct elections, but probably in practice would have disparate impacts in more densely populated counties.
Right. So the one you're talking about, so there's a couple of different variations of this in different bills, I think, but the one that I think is in SB 7 calls for uniformity in early voting hours and days, that it should be from 7 to 7. And if a locality decides to open up weekend early voting, then it also has to be 7 to 7 on those days. And this has been criticized, of course, by people for saying that if you are somebody that works, long or late hours, that this cuts down on, the access of people that work late, may get there particularly, late in the day and, be banking on being able to vote after 7 or extra early. So
not really clear how this addresses fraud.
Yeah, well, there's that.
Just let that alone anyway.
So there's a lot, for now. So so there's all kinds of other things that are floating around out there, but things that are in some of the big bills, a prohibition on allowing local elected officials to proactively send out applications for people that are eligible to vote by mail. So if you want to vote by mail, you have to request it. It can't be, the phrase in one of the bills is a prohibition on the solicitation of mail-in ballots.
Yeah. A quick version of this would be, think about anything that was controversial about about the process of Texas elections where there was conflict, whether between counties and the state or even, between Republicans and the governor. And essentially there's legislation meant to address that. Drive-through voting, hours, mail-in ballots,
Yeah, although, I think one of the things I also noticed about this is that there's also, in this kind of there's also, the level of detail. And that might even still fall into that, but the level of detail for some of these things, the civil penalties for non-compliant registrars, digital ballot tracking for mail ballots, that would be, created and provided by the Secretary of State. So there's also another kind of common theme here that brings state level authority into various regulation and enforcement mechanisms. Things like, requiring documentation from those that are providing assistance to voters that need assistance, identifying who you are, providing justification for you providing assistance. I think this also speaks to the, the clamping down on, frankly, on people with disabilities. Also though, directly to what you're saying, no drive-through voting. There's even a section in one of the bills that, sort of prohibits the creation of temporary structures, including, which speaks to the reduction in mobile voting places we saw last time. You can't be paid to be a poll assistant, no compensation, pretty steep punishment if you are caught, doing things with compensation. So, a whole raft of things, many of which again are tied to what we saw last time. And frankly, many, I've not gone and kind of taken account because there's too many provisions and too many bills, but many of these, you can draw a pretty straight line to things that were done in Harris County,
Mm-hmm.
and to a lesser degree Travis, but especially Harris County,
Mm-hmm.
where they really sort of went all out there to make it easier for people to vote, and in their and I think they would argue to accommodating the pandemic situations that clearly were on a lot of people's minds. And I say that not just because of what people said, but because of the turn that we saw in the proportion of people that did both early and mail-in voting versus day of.
Yeah, and I would even go, I would even say there's even a broader, concern that a place like Harris County has in a state like Texas, which is that, it's an extremely spread out, extremely populated and diverse county. And so ultimately conducting elections in Harris County is going to be more difficult than in Fort Bend, right? Even though it's close, right? I mean, and this is sort of, I think, the interesting thing, we'll get into this, but I mean, this is where we start to think about the impact of uniformity and whether uniformity is really something that can be, and again, uniformity across the counties in Texas who ultimately administer these elections is something that can actually be achieved with, let's say, with uniform laws.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question. We'll come back to we were talking about this offline yesterday, the day before, that there's a kernel of something in this uniformity argument that one can see,
Mm-hmm.
but where the line is in an appropriate degree of uniformity, I think is not.
Right.
Is not completely obvious and is being played, and is at play here. And I think the gray areas are at play here. So, let's talk a little bit about this, about what the likely reception of this. Now, to step back on that, there's been less so this week, but last week, when the governor and some of his, chosen leaders on this, specifically Paul Betancourt and Briscoe Cain, held a press event to kind of roll these provisions and roll the push out last week. It was part of a lot of national coverage. And I think that, the national coverage has been, that I've seen, and this is probably reflective of my viewing habits given where we are, but has largely been negative in the mainstream media. And, you can call that the elite media or whatever you want. But, the major national audience newspapers, the major kind of networks and cable channels, all were, I thought, fairly straightforward in looking at the proposals along these lines that are happening in dozens of states around the country, generally states, or actually I shouldn't say generally, almost exclusively states with either Republican majorities in the legislature or here majorities in the legislature plus a Republican governor, was pretty critical. And critical in a way that I think didn't pause very often in a lot of the stuff that I read, other than the, on the other hand, paragraphs in the stories, to say that, there might be an argument for this. And so, we've looked at public opinion, and I think, public opinion helps explain that to some degree, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly part of the explanation, right? So, I mean, in our February poll, we asked people, basically whether the official U.S. election results and official Texas election results are accurate or not, and just sort of baseline, what do you think? And, mimicking the national narrative, only 23% of Texas Republicans said that U.S. election results are accurate. 73% said that they are not accurate, including 52%, so a majority of Republicans who say that U.S. election results are very inaccurate. Now, surely some of this was informed by the 2020 election and Donald Trump's defeat.
His messaging about that.
And his messaging about that defeat before that defeat and for much of the 5 years leading up to it.
Right.
And so, but ultimately, but I think that is almost like a walk forward and walk back to say, hey, look, this is probably, partially reflective of the moment, but also this has been baked into the cake now for, at least 5 years, but really we could argue very simply for a decade plus. So it's not that far off what the baseline attitudes are. So this is kind of, and you could say that it's kind of strange that we have all this activity in the space because 76% of those same Republican voters in Texas rate Texas election results as accurate. Now, 20% still say that they're not accurate. So one in five. So that's still, a significant number of Republicans who are skeptical of Texas election results. But ultimately, it's not as though, based on perceptions of the outcome and the outcome being just the results, that are reported, that Republicans think that there's much going wrong at least with the end product of Texas elections. So that's sort of the starting point here. But, and despite all this, but, going back to the reception, either because of this, if we think about the U.S. results, or despite it, if we think about the Texas results, a plurality of Republicans still want voting laws made more strict in Texas, 46%, a nearly equal share. I think 44% say the laws should be left alone. But ultimately, it's not an issue for Republican legislators to go and deliver on what is perceived by Republican voters to be a problem generally, even if that perception is merely a perception.
Right? Yeah, and I think in some places, elsewhere in the country, there have been, minor incidents of Republican pushback. I think that's been most prominent in Georgia, but Georgia, the Georgia legislative Democrats or Republicans have also gone the furthest with the restrictions that they're proposing. But I've not seen among legislative Republicans, as I've not watched every moment of every hearing, but watching these hearings, there are varying degrees of interest in this. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that I've seen any instances of elected Republicans standing up and saying maybe we got to slow down here. Well, there's just no evidence of that, and I think the polling suggests one of the reasons that, there's a chicken egg question here, but I think, as you kind of implied,
I think I know where the chicken is.
Exactly. I think if you go back far enough, we can find the chickens.
Well, and look, we don't even need to go back that far. When we're, ultimately, and we're talking about the chicken eggs, we're talking about, is this about, let's just say what we're saying here, right? Is this about, people organically coming up with this idea based on evidence and experience?
Let us explain our rural metaphor.
Yeah, well, then let me get the straw out of my mouth. Hold on a second. But the idea here is this some sort of organic set of views that's based on experience, or actual evidence of wrongdoing? Well, no, it's not. We know that it's not, because there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. And we know that despite this, it's been talked about repeatedly and at the highest levels of government in particular for the last 2 years. I find it striking that actually in some ways to look at data like this, even though we've seen it before, so it's not striking in and of itself, but it's striking if you just consider, I hate to say it this way, but let's just step back and try to be rational for a second. And I hate saying that, but Republican elected officials, including the president, using the full weight of the Justice Department, and every Republican who he could find, sought out voter fraud in the 2020 election. They went to court, and the court said, you have no evidence. They, literally, Dan Patrick said, I will give someone money to provide me with evidence. I don't know how that's gone. We haven't heard back about that, but there was a reward. No evidence.
And I think what we've heard is wasn't it the lieutenant governor or the secretary of state in Pennsylvania who said he had evidence of voter fraud. It had been committed by Republicans, and maybe Lieutenant Governor Patrick, check your messages. I think he didn't really get much of a response to that.
Well, yes. Well, he wasn't listening. Well, anyway, let's leave that alone. But this is the thing here. If this were in any way connected to an actual policy problem, you would think that, this long discussion we've had, this long and very public discussion that we've had about it, that's failed to actually uncover any, would change people's attitudes. But ultimately, it's not really based on actual experience or actual evidence.
And, I don't think I'm crazy to have noticed. There has been, it's almost as if the discussion after 2020 has produced a subtle shift. And I think this is, I've spent probably the last 24 hours just trying to, turning this over in my head back and forth, trying to figure out exactly.
I'm excited.
What I think about this. But I don't know. But in some ways it's obvious. But I do think there's been kind of a subtle shift as we look at this discussion, we parse out, all of this kind of very detailed things, more or less, in the legislation that's rolling around in the legislature right now. And this, the kind of ongoing, search for, the holy grail of widespread voter fraud that never shows up. Something else has happened in the meantime. And whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's the accumulated discussion, while the voter fraud argument still gets trotted out, it's almost as if the backup argument has become the primary argument, which is twofold, which is one, any instance of voter fraud is too much because the system has to be, essentially, pristine. Virtuous as Caesar's wife. Is that
I don't know that one.
Cliche? But also I think, and more subtly and a little bit oddly new is that there is now evidence of voter fraud, or there's now evidence that people believe that the system does not have integrity or is not secure or can't be trusted. And we have to go the extra length just because people have those beliefs, even though those beliefs have been cultivated based on the initial false claims that we're now kind of abandoning because the evidence is just never there. And this is why, there's this kind of, there's an odd dynamic here in which, these beliefs, just the beliefs, whether they're founded or not in any empirical reality, are enough to serve as a ground for all of this. And that's why I think the public opinion numbers become important, but they become important from my perspective, in a kind of unfortunate way, in the sense that the evidence is now people's beliefs in something that never happened rather than the thing itself that one would hope those beliefs would be grounded in.
It's funny. I have a note here because as we're coming to do this podcast, I was thinking about my thoughts on this, and I came at it from a different angle, but get to the same place. And it's funny the way you describe it. It's sort of war on terror-esque, in that there's never an end to the war on terror, right? Because how will as a policy matter, how would you know when the war on terror is ended? The same is true of election integrity. Ultimately, the elections will never have 100% integrity. I don't really, I don't really know what that means. Ultimately, people will make mistakes. Sometimes sometimes people do things, purposefully shady, sometimes not. The point being, there's no systemic fraud to underlie the basis of it. But if fraud is your target as a policy goal, there's no clear end game, given that there's no fraud to stop in the first place.
Yeah.
Right. So by shifting it to election integrity, you shift it to some sort of amorphous positive good that ultimately you can always make the system, you can always use putting more integrity into the system as a rationale for making stricter laws around voting, because underlying this all is the assumption that has been cultivated, let's just say almost primarily among Republican voters, that the system is rife with fraud.
Right. Well, but I guess what I'm thinking now is that we've almost moved on from the object being the fraud to the object being people's trust in the system. And I think I have a quote in my notes somewhere from, something the governor said to that effect, that, we have to make sure that people's trust is restored. And that's, sort of the direction we need to move in. And it just, in an odd way, it's almost surrendering on the initial fraud claims, but, and kind of going, but now we are where we are, and, people don't trust the system. Who knows how that happened? Yeah. But we really gotta shore up trust, even if, some of the coverage, and the governor's been asked this, he's been talking about it. And he said, we haven't really found much, but, we still have to make sure that people have faith in democracy.
Well, and the thing is, I think,
and I don't, yeah. And that gets to the perpetual war thing you're talking about. I think the difference between the war on terror is that, the war on terror, you had at least, a 9/11. There's never been an election 9/11 in this country. And to
I don't know, Jim.
To the extent there was, it really wasn't about election fraud. So,
well,
so there's an interesting kind of dynamic that's going on here. I think that is, and again, this will make you, but it's obvious, to me, it's another one of those instances where, you sort of have, the shadow of some actual thing that really was never there, but it still serves as as something that instigates all of this action. And I think we should also, and something else I've been kind of grappling with is that that argument also, in an odd way, is going to speaks to Democrats.
Right.
Now, the actions don't, the legislation don't, but if but if your point is you should have trust in democracy and the process should be, and you're willing to use the words and the language of, fairness, our data also show that, Democrats are not without their doubts of the system. They're just fundamentally different doubts based on different historical experience and a different level of, or, a different kind of concern. And we see that in our data too.
Right. I mean, just to hand wave at that for a second, right? So, I mean, overall, about 90% of Democrats trust the accuracy of both the U.S. and Texas election results. A slight majority, 50%, want the election laws made less strict. About another third would leave them alone. But, going back to October of the election year, 83% of Democrats said that eligible voters being prevented from voting, so basically some sort of voter suppression, would be a serious problem in the 2020 election, which was a near mirror image of the 81% of Republicans who said that people voting who are not eligible would be a serious problem during the election. But, I mean, the thing is, I'm thinking about what you're saying about this, and it is interesting in the sense that, if we do shift the language to one of election integrity, which in and of itself is a message tested phrase which is really I think the goal of which is actually to shift away from this focus on non-existent fraud, probably towards something that everyone can get behind. I mean, ultimately, as pollsters, we know who is going to be against integrity. I mean, generally speaking, if you say people
security for that,
are you for security? Are you for integrity? The answer is yes. Ultimately, it requires a pretty sophisticated person, generally, to understand that maybe they don't support integrity in the way that you mean it, right? But ultimately, I think there is an aspect to this that's kind of interesting that you raise that I'm thinking about now, which is when push comes to shove, and let's say these laws get passed, which there's a very good chance they will, and it'll make it slightly more difficult to vote in a state that it's already pretty difficult to vote in. We have some of the lowest voter turnout in the country. We have some of the strictest laws in the country. Real quick, going back to what you're saying about the national coverage, I think I'm a little bit jaded because these are actually, I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but relative to a lot of the laws that have been passed related to voting in elections in Texas in the last decade, these are relatively minor in terms of what they would do to restrict voting, at least on their face. Now, that raises a question, right? If we say, well, look, if we're talking about election integrity, not voter fraud, we want to create a uniform system where elections in one county in Texas are held the same way as elections in other county, there's a fair reading of that says that is a reasonable goal, right? And that each county shouldn't basically be running elections however it wants. However, we know from the same polling data in February, the Republicans as a group find it easier than anybody else to vote in the state. 76% of Republicans say it's very easy to vote in the state of Texas. The only group that's even close, and I think this is the point, this is the key point here, 75% of rural residents say it's very easy to vote in this state, compared to 54% and 59% of urban and suburban residents, respectively. Ultimately, if these laws create longer lines in Harris County, in Dallas County, in Travis County, in Bexar, right? And election nights routinely feature long lines in urban parts of the state with mostly non-white voters waiting and hoping to cast their ballots. Or if we see, let's say turnout discontinuities, after passage of these laws, let's call it, isn't that a nice way to put that?
It's nice.
Yeah. Artful. I think, the question is going to be, is this, does that election still look like it has integrity? And I think, in a state like this, where again, the share of the rural population is shrinking, the share of the non-white population is growing, the share of young, diverse Texans living in and around urban areas is only going to get larger, and nothing that Republicans do about the voting rules is going to change that, but it's going to make some of the glaring discrepancies in the way these laws end up actually getting applied even more glaring for national media and others. And so I think there is sort of a losing end to this, or a point at which, I think your point is right, which is going to be greater opportunities for Democrats to say, yeah, we're for election integrity too, like making sure that everybody who wants to cast a vote and has the legal right to do so can. And that's going to be a hard argument and that's going to be a hard argument for Republicans to argue against, and especially at a time when Democrats are probably going to be becoming more competitive in the state, not necessarily in the next cycle, but in the next few cycles, let's say.
although we sort of see where that discussion is going to go. I mean, to go back and kind of flip the order of some of the data you discussed earlier. I mean, on one hand, a big majority of Republicans say that it's easy to vote in Texas. That it's very easy. In fact, I think 76% of Republicans say it's very easy. But then, you look at that in the context of a big chunk of those Republicans who also say the laws should be more strict.
Right.
And I think that intersection is key in the last results that we saw. I mean, that kind of is the thing that really begins to underline how all of this discussion is really received differently depending on partisanship. So, speaking of partisanship, so as we wind down, I want to get, meta for a second.
Oh no.
And we've talked about this offline before.
I live in the meta.
I find this South meta.
Oh, okay.
There's a for some reason I found that very funny. I don't know why. There's a problem of trying to be fair and even-handed that I think has been woven through this discussion, as with some others. But I think that there's a real sort of difficulty in this that I find kind of, both unsettling, and I'm always grappling with it and talking about this publicly, but that I think is real, and that this is one of those areas where false equivalency is a real threat.
Mm-hmm.
That in the effort to be even-handed and nonpartisan and fair, there are a couple of very sticky things here, which is one, as we keep saying, and I think that, we've kind of stumbled on a way to talk about it, to kind of talk around the problem so far today, is that, there's not a problem with the electoral system in terms of voter fraud. Mm-hmm. Or dysfunction. It's just, the system is not perfect, and the voting system has never been perfect. And we've talked about this several times on this before, but the idea that you're going to really just get everybody to get behind some notion of widespread voter fraud is just a dead jam. I mean, there's just nothing there, mm-hmm. Right? Been trying to find it, can't find it. That argument was pushed further than it's ever been pushed before in the last election by the president and his allies, and it still came up with nothing, right? And then there's, having to take seriously the fact that, only very rarely and usually accidentally will Republican sponsors of legislation like this say, look, this is about preserving our advantages. When, it's almost impossible to look at most of the groups that are most highly targeted by these kinds of measures, even the kind of pointillist ones we've been talking about, that it's not going to, have the most impact, as you were kind of implying, in urban areas. Among people of color, among younger people, among non-rural populations.
Among wage workers working hourly.
Around wage worker, that's another excellent one. And so I think that really just hovers over all of this in a way that makes it, difficult to discuss. And I think that, I would give Republicans credit for sort of achieving a certain amount of judo with this, in that, they've developed rhetorical tools to just sort of turn that back on their critics in a way that, has been a successful deflection in a lot of cases. And, these things wind up getting passed, and they either stay in force or they don't get resolved, until, after years of court battles by which, people have moved on to new means, new technologies, et cetera. I mean, the voter ID discussion is an interesting example of that, right?
I only say that because it went on forever.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the legislation, there's still some identification things buried in some of these proposals. you'll see them as I was going through all the stuff ad nauseum, that ID provisions are going to come up again. So I don't know. I'm flagging that. I don't really. I mean, I think it's a really fascinating piece of this. And in the past 6 or 8 months or the past year, the person, not surprisingly, who got caught saying the quiet part loud was in fact the former president,
Right.
who on tape at some point said, "Hey, look, you guys got to do you got to push
Right.
this stuff, or Republicans are never going to win again."
Well, I was going to say even further. I mean, really, the most clear evidence of fraud or attempted fraud we've seen in this election comes from that same president basically telling the Georgia Secretary of State to find him the votes.
Yeah,
I mean,
attempted fraud.
I guess he didn't succeed, so that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real, it's a real, it's a tough thing about this. I mean, you and I were commenting, we won't name any names or even publications, that, we were reading something that came out in the last few days, that was an account, kind of a table setter for these bills coming up Monday. It was, pretty egregiously, I thought, in the tank and critical of Republicans. And, and it was not so much the reading of the evidence as it was the language it was used and the lack of, sort of.
But that's the key point here, right? It's hard to talk about this in a fair and serious way that doesn't bring up, discussions of adherence to democratic norms, at least. Yeah. And if not, and honestly, if not, let's say, partisan advantage, certainly, but also racism and, I'll just say racism. And ultimately,
and fundamental issues of fairness.
Right.
And race.
And so once you bring that up, I mean, the problem is that, it takes the discussion makes the discussion go into another turn that I think is pretty easy for a lot of people to tune out who don't want to hear it.
Right.
Right.
Well, and fuels, it winds up fueling the discussion that the media is in the tank for the Democrats.
Well, yeah, or that the detractors are just being partisans for the other side.
Right.
And that they don't really care whether elections are safe or not. Just go back to honest.
Yeah, and I think, it's a problem that's yet to be licked on this. And I kind of understand, to use the term that's kind of gets overused now, I'm kind of tired of, but nonetheless, in these pieces where people are, journalists are writing, and often very good journalists are just kind of piling on saying, essentially, for lack of a better term, like, this is all, voter fraud is bullshit. These people are just trying to, you sense a kind of an almost like anger and fatigue at being gaslit for so long. Mm-hmm. That for years and years of having to go, well, write that paragraph that says, even though, there have been many claims about combating voter fraud, there are very few and you just, I myself sometimes get to, it's like, oh yeah, you got to put this in here.
Right. Republicans say this. Democrats say this.
I think that fatigue is out there, and I'm not making an excuse, but as an explanation, for, I think it's up to an editor to catch that.
Yeah.
But I think it's why those stories sometimes are we're seeing more of those stories.
I read an article today. Joe Strauss sat down with Evan Smith and basically, on this topic said, that this is a losing strategy for Republicans in the long run. And I think, one, it's, nice to see any Republican kind of acknowledge some fault with this strategy, but I would say, they're staying in the meta. There is, there is something we say like, look, just take your step back for a second and let's just acknowledge that this makes it harder for people to vote. Most of these provisions, of the provisions we're talking about over time, it certainly doesn't make it easier. It certainly makes it more challenging, and it makes it more challenging for some people than for others. Right. Ultimately, in the long run, resisting, restricting, or removing fundamental rights or freedoms from people is never going to be popular.
Yeah.
There's just sort of there's an aspect to this, which is, and we said this before, but, there's no clear end game to this. I think you're right. I think, you've made me update the way I think about it in the sense, there's no clear end game because you can't ultimately stamp out something that never existed in the first place. So you just have to keep going if it's just about perception. But on the other hand, in this case,
you have to turn it into something else.
Well, and that's what they've done. Right.
Right.
But I think, and I think there's a little bit of a gray, to me, this is totally as a public opinion. This is, sitting in my seat as as a pollster, public opinion researcher, scholar, whatever you want to call it. Like, there's a bit of a grace period, I think, right now. Now we've seen this with other stuff before. When voter ID began and people said, hey, do you think, we should have voter ID? Do you think people should present an ID at the polls? Honestly, universally, people said yes. This included Democrats,
including
Republicans,
Democrats,
independents, African Americans. Once it became clear to Democrats.
We say in the beginning, just to clarify, I mean, we're talking like 2010.
Yeah, I'm talking like 2010, 2009, 2010.
2009, 2010. Yeah.
Yeah, and you had majority African American support in Texas for voter ID laws. Ultimately, once it became clear that voter ID laws were not about necessarily stamping out fraud, but about really regulating who could vote, right, based on the types of IDs that people have, it flipped. It became
right. It flipped among Democrats.
It flipped among Democrats. It flipped dramatically among African Americans,
right?
And it became a mobilizing feature of President Obama's successful 2012 reelection campaign was highlighting, especially among African Americans, the threat they faced from these sorts of voting restrictions. Ultimately, I don't see how we don't head in a similar direction with this. I think, we're in a grace period right now where the term election integrity, again, is something that, if you don't know what it means or don't know what it implies, why would you be against it? And honestly, that's what a lot of people respond to in surveys sometimes.
Yes.
That's going to change.
And I think the voter ID, an empirical question, but I think it's, and frankly, I think it's evident in the data we're talking about today to some degree that, what you're calling a grace period. In other words, this kind of catch up, I would think of it as kind of a catch up period where, the elite, Democratic opinion leaders and elites, kind of catch up with what's coming from the other side, is likely to be shorter.
Yeah, I think so. Well, now,
it's the baseline. It could, they're going to have, less far to move. They're going to need to move fewer people, and they're going to need to move, and it'll take less time to move them. And I think that's part of, and we're seeing that. I mean, people like Stacey Abrams has become a national figure based in part on, the receptivity to this argument.
It's become one of the fundamental axes of conflict between the party. And I mean, and I think the truth is, someone who studies politics, I think we should all be nervous about that.
Yeah.
That's not a good thing. I mean,
no, I think that's right. And I think that, and I think, in a much more trivial sense, I should just end it there, but I can't because I've got this in my head, which is,
I want to hear it.
Well, from a Texas point of view, if not for Georgia, Texas would probably be in the forefront of this discussion. And, right now, Georgia is the example, and it's the example in part because Georgia has been so pivotal this election cycle anyway, in both presidential politics and especially obviously in the Senate special elections. But I think there is, I'm fairly sure, I'm fairly convinced, and I only have to convince myself that, so that's easy.
Yes, because you're good at that.
that if Georgia, was not where it was in the political universe right now, and were they not pushing so hard, that Texas would be the key exhibit in this in the way that they were with the voter ID law.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Ago. So with that, thanks for being here, Josh. Thanks to our crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Thank you for listening, and we will be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.